Hi folks, welcome to Operating Cloud Systems, Cumulus Technologies webinar series on operating cloud environments. In this episode, we're going to focus on a number of key technologies, but specifically we're going to look at the systems management market, the changes that are happening that allow us to start considering the operations of cloud, benefits to actually learning these new operational environments and tools, some of the skill sets that you'll actually need, sort of what's happening and how these shifts are happening for you, and then resources for continued education, sort of the next steps from this basic outline that we'll be covering today. First question I always get is, who are you and we even be talking about this? Well, my name is Robert Starmer, Cumulus Technologies. We're a boutique consultancy. We focus on helping enterprises enable cloud. And what that really means is we're looking at all of the tools that it takes to actually enable these new cloud services and technologies for enterprise customers. Because everybody has a different set of tools and applications that they're looking at. How those applications and services actually map to cloud environments is really the key thing that we're looking at. I've been doing this, looking at data center operations since 1998, looking at that from a number of different technology areas, but really focusing today on things like the OpenStack services environment and that class of cloud system, an API automated data center environment. We're looking, of course, at the newer changes that are occurring right now, things like the Kubernetes, Dockers, and other container systems that exist. And really, we're looking at this entire service space, which is looking at bare metal servers being mapped all the way through to how applications are continuously deployed or continuously delivered in modern API-driven service environments. You can find a number of our services and information, of course, on our website at cumul.us. But more importantly, you can find our YouTube channel at 5 Minutes of Cloud. This is a channel where we provide little 5-minute segments on cloud services and cloud technologies, sort of the latest and greatest of what's going on in the cloud environment. That's one of our key assets for everybody to be able to find more information about what cloud is and how that actually works for folks. If we think about the big change, I mean, this is really the shift that we're talking about today. In the past, often you were a systems manager for a specific service component. That might be the entire compute entity, so a server running an application. That might have been the focus of your job. Or maybe you specifically focused on the network services and functions, or even just focused in on storage capabilities. This was a classic model that, especially as enterprises grew, it was very simple to sort of silo people into these different areas. They owned those technology spaces and services, and that really was the capability that they were enabling for their particular enterprise environment. Applications in those services were often black box. Yes, the operator, the sysadmin, might actually install the application, maybe even do some work like backups and some of the underlying systems management, but the application itself was not something that they ran and operated. Instead, it was the system itself that was the real focus. Well, we're seeing this big shift, and the shift is that all of these services are being combined in one resource environment. At the extreme end of it, we have people that are DevOps practitioners that potentially own everything from the operating system, the storage, the backup services, all the way up through the actual application deployment and continuous redelivery of that application into the functional environment over and over and over again. In addition to just that sort of single box and data set, the back-end storage, the network services that tie it all together, we're seeing operations that start to include the ability to scale an application, not just provide reliability potentially, but actually scale the application service out. We're looking at application infrastructure. Maybe now we're managing databases separate from the application services themselves. And even taking that to the extreme where application catalogs are being built. So tools that application consumers can use to either just deploy their application environment, the different services that they need. Well, I need some data service, I need some messaging services, I actually need analytics against the application environment that I want. I'm just going to grab those from a catalog and stitch them together to make my environment work. That's the extreme end of what's happening in the systems management space. This is a big shift. This shift really takes us from classic data center to really cloud environments. And I think this is the big shift that we're seeing, is that operations is no longer just about like the bare metal and operating system environment. In reality, it becomes this automated services focus for things. And if we just focus in on the compute service of that, even though I see operations in the cloud space, the cloud model for operations being a multi-system approach. No longer can you just be a compute-focused resource. There still are a number of changes just in the compute space that we really have to wrap our head around in order to really be a powerful applications services administrator today, really the cloud admin today. So, like I said, it's not just about bare metal. It's not just about the base operating system information that makes up that server. We're really starting to look at clusters, groups, sort of the whole scale family and scale mentality of operating servers. So the server operating is still a piece of that. I still need, for example, my MCSE or my Red Hat certification, but it's no longer just that single system that I'm looking at. I'm starting to look at clustering. I'm starting to look at distributed service. One of the things that has really driven that change, of course, is the concept of virtualization in the compute space. So I'm going from things like a physical server running my entire application to a virtualized physical server running my application. And the extreme version of that today is the container service space, where I've actually taken my application and bundled it so that just the processes that need to run, the actual application processes, are the atomic unit of compute. This change is really the biggest shift today, and this has happened over the last couple of years where this technology has really taken hold. But this changes how I think about operating my compute environment. And so again, if I just focus in on that one sort of siloed environment, just the compute, this is really the real service space, is that my applications are moving up the stack, and the application developers are thinking about less and less about operating the entire environment. They're just thinking about their application. That means that we as cloud operators have to take on a larger and larger piece of that puzzle, where we have to either provide the platform or catalog level services, even sort of software as a service at the extreme end of this, capabilities for our application developers. But we have to start thinking about all of the pieces that make up that application that the developers no longer want to focus on. So rather than a developer thinking about deploying their database service and managing that as a piece of their application, they're saying, I'd rather use that as a service, so give me a different interface so I only have to think about having access to database rather than operating and manipulating that database service. And again, this maps back to the concept of scale. I'd like to be able to do database operations in a scale-out environment without having to think about managing the database. So we see a number of services that are springing up in the cloud space, whether they be a third-party cloud environment or something that you build privately, that are just there to provide the database functions, be those SQL class databases or NoSQL databases or even big data service components providing those databases. The other key area in the sort of the platform service space is this concept of messaging. As our applications look to scale, as we're thinking more about applications as entities separate from the compute environment to a certain extent, those entities have to be able to talk to each other to stay in sync. And that's the messaging services space. So yet another component that as a compute operator in the past, you would never have had to think about. It's just another application component, but now it's becoming a part of the infrastructure that a cloud operator specifically has to start thinking about. It's not just about that single virtualized service, it's about the architecture of the entire system that has to be managed. Another key shift, of course, is in the network service space. Anyone who has focused exclusively on the network for any period of time has heard about the shift into the software-defined network service environment. This is really taking the services space, much like in the compute environment where I used to think about these things monolithically. I'm just going to look at providing segregation, maybe some services like load balancing or even firewall services, doing those things within the network. I'm going to shift that pretty dramatically now and actually let the software, the application itself, start driving what's going on within the network itself. The virtualization also has dramatically changed how networks are consumed within a modern data center, and specifically in the cloud data center. We're looking at virtualization of compute service all the way down to the containerization of applications in this virtual environment. And often those environments do not use the physical network the way we would have used it in the past. Instead, we're actually virtualizing a part of the network service as well that's being mapped into the compute space. One of the early sort of roadblocks for a lot of folks was that the network team didn't have a way of managing the network services that lived within that virtual compute environment. And we saw a lot of issues with how the teams were able to maintain their sort of system state where there was an overlap between where that system state existed. Sort of the push towards this cloud operator has started happening when people just started virtualizing things, not even really driving to full cloud services environments. In addition, one of the technology spaces that was often used more for an availability capability, specifically the load balancing tools, have become more and more a part of the overall application environment. So applications suddenly needed the ability to modify and manipulate what was going on in the network service space, which was usually outside of what the networking teams were usually able to provide. Often they could provide a static environment, even with some knowledge about what the application was doing, but rarely did they allow the application to actually control how the network services infrastructure worked. The software-defined networking services have allowed that to change. They've allowed a better modification, an automated modification of those environments. But that's also changed a little bit in terms of the obfuscation of some of that access. One of the classic issues is that most software-defined networking technologies use some form of tunneling as a way of allowing the software to create new paths, new secured layer 2 or potentially even layer 3 network service segregated pathways between these virtualized switching or routing components that are now out in the compute infrastructure. That's great from the automatable capabilities, so allowing automation to occur, but it does actually create a problem, and that is that it obfuscates that forwarding path. Suddenly the network teams that used to have a good idea of how traffic was flowing in their networks have lost some of that visibility, and a lot of the SDN work, software-defined networking work, has gone into trying to understand how those pieces actually fit together more effectively. Let's not leave the storage team out of this. There are big changes that are happening there as well. I would say the biggest are that what was in the past what was a segregated storage environment has actually been combined with the network services team, and the same problem that the network teams have suddenly come to light as well for storage teams. If I'm going to provide the class of service, the class of performance, the class of segregation that I had seen in the past in terms of my storage access, I have a real problem in doing that without managing the virtual storage environments much more efficiently. In addition, much like the network services that are being driven by the application automation environment, basically the ability to turn on and manage my application services in an automated fashion, suddenly I have to be able to manipulate my network services for storage, manipulate the performance services for storage, because that's really where I think storage has been moving, is to providing the level of performance different resources need, and also managing that in an increasingly virtualized space. It's no longer good enough to say that this physical server has to have a specific storage pathway and a specific set of storage access targets. Basically, they're the quality of service components in the storage space. Now I have to think about that from a virtualized space, and even more critically today, with this shift towards this concept of a container as an application element, understanding how those application pieces fit together at that level. And lastly, I need to start thinking about some of the tools that I used to use in the enterprise that were effectively standard tools, again, being modified and managed in a different fashion. If my application is distributed, how do I back up that distributed application? How do I provide some of the infrastructure management services that I used to have in the storage space that no longer really fit with how applications are developed? The needs have shifted. That doesn't mean that backups and snapshots and services of this nature aren't still critical, but I'm thinking more about how am I managing and manipulating the storage for a particular entity. Can I distribute that more effectively so that I don't need to back up a specific running instance? I might still want to create a data snapshot, but the backup model has shifted in those sorts of distributed systems environments. So network, compute, storage, all of these are moving towards virtualization as being the sort of the default environment. The containerization of the application is also dramatically shifting how these services are consumed. And I would say automating these capabilities is really the key, the real big shift that's going on that's driving, that's really driving this. So with these shifts comes opportunity. Application development is really changing. We're seeing this push towards the DevOps services model or the application ops and infrastructure ops sort of services models. I've been talking a lot about ops dev, sort of the fact that there are two sides to this systems model, and where that demarcation point is really depends on the class of applications and how those applications fit together. But it really comes from the application model. That's what's driving this need, this change, this shift in the data center. Application developers are expecting that the data center is becoming automatable. In other words, as an application developer, I can just ask for services and I can automate the change in those services myself. I don't necessarily need to have an IT operations team come help me with the individual pieces. But that means that really being an application operator or being a cloud operator, providing that infrastructure, is being able to take the knowledge of the data center, virtualization technologies, the containerization of applications, and managing and manipulating that. So suddenly a data center operator that used to be a systems manager, really focused only on the system, has to understand storage and network services. We have to understand applications and how they scale, how the scale of an application or the scalability of an application applies to our data center. When we start thinking about where this changes not just what we were doing in the past, certainly we were doing monitoring, we were trying to understand what our network, what our storage performances were, do we have enough capacity for the applications that are being developed and deployed, but I suddenly need to do that in a more dynamic environment. I need to start thinking about the analytics tools that I as an operator are using, not just the ones that my application developers are asking for. For example, big data services are very common these days. People are talking about how they can actually understand the data that is making up their business in a more efficient fashion. So we're seeing more talk about data science and data scientists working within their environments, so new applications being built. But we as operators, and especially as cloud operators, so API-driven automation in our data center operators, really need to understand the analytics tools and backends that are available, because we need to start making use of those in how we operate these services environments. We need to start managing and deploying new services like big data services and providing those as a part of that automatable environment, rather than having individual application developers own those services, much like databases, whether they be SQL or NoSQL-based databases. We need to start managing those tools as well. So the opportunity really is this. Let me understand all these new technology components. Let me run and operate them for the application developers and make the data center a more efficient service space for running new enterprise applications. This is what makes up a cloud operator today. And really, when I think about this space and what I was hoping to talk to you folks about today, this is really the key, is understanding that application development is changing. And as those changes occur, certainly there will still be classic enterprise-grade applications that have dedicated infrastructure, dedicated services, whether they be virtual or not, but are managed from that sort of two-factor system where somebody managed infrastructure pieces, somebody else managed the operations of their application, and somebody else actually built that application themselves. Those separations of state will still occur, but we're also seeing this shift towards people saying, well, if I can actually manage my own infrastructure, or at least understand how I can operate an automatable infrastructure, I change the game for my application development and my application deployment. That means that we as operators need to be smarter about how our applications are deployed in our data center environments, how we provide better service by providing monitoring, by providing analytics against what the infrastructure is doing, so that we're building and managing the right infrastructure. It doesn't help to virtualize if you try to put all of your applications on one machine and the machine just can't handle the load. We need to understand those things. The same is true for network service, the same is true for storage service. Just because I virtualize things, is my application actually still running at the appropriate speed? Am I getting the right storage performance? Is a bigger and bigger question. And one of the reasons that you see this push towards high performance storage is to deal with the interactions at the container and virtualized operating system level against those storage environments. So this is really the space and the opportunity. Now, like I said, nothing changes overnight. If you liked being a sysadmin, you can still be a sysadmin, but self-service infrastructure is becoming business critical infrastructure. So it's no longer good enough to just say, well, I'm just going to focus on the one compute component. You really need to understand the entire consumption life cycle of those applications environments. Understanding the analytics against the operating environment, is it going to scale? Is the performance still going to be there? Is really critical to making all these pieces work. And supporting the automation of this really requires a different approach to administration. You can't just automate virtualization. That no longer works because I need to now manage the virtualization of my network and my storage services. And when I've started virtualizing those services, if I haven't built an analytics tool set and an analytics backend to understand the monitoring of this dynamically changing environment, I'm never going to be able to provide the class of service that my customers, especially my data center service customers, are expecting, which means they're likely to move to a different service altogether. And it doesn't really change my burden. Moving from my own data center into Amazon, for example, doesn't mean that the application operations just goes away and is no longer something I have to think about. In fact, I would say it makes it even more critical to understand the automation of the analytics against the operating infrastructure rather than just thinking about the fact that it's been passed off to somebody else. One of the biggest failures that we've seen is thinking about the world as just a sysadmin. Oh, well, if you take it out of my system space, I no longer have to worry about it. That is less true today than it ever was in the past, if it was ever true to begin with. Understanding the entire systems environment, which is going to include third-party cloud services, third-party cloud tools as a part of the business environment, is systems critical. And again, this is really the opportunity. To be the new generation sysadmin, to be the cloud admin, really means understanding how applications are deployed today, how application services are made available today, and understanding the analytics against all of those sorts of capabilities. So what can we do about this? Well, number one, education is key. And while our focus as a company tends to be on the end-to-end life cycle, not just educating people, but understanding how to build and utilize and leverage these different technologies, education really is the number one thing that you can do for yourself to really become a cloud admin and really provide value for your customers and your application environments. So when we start thinking about education, it's not just about understanding the compute, network, and storage services. Those are areas that you still have to come up to speed on the latest technology and virtualization, the shifts that containerization are starting to bring to the environment. But really, I would say it is critical to start understanding applications. If you understand how applications are being developed, the next generation of applications, even if they're not yet being deployed in your environments, understanding what that's going to do to the virtualization space, the storage services space, the capabilities and systems environments for this automated deployment environment, understanding that leads you to new technology changes that are required in the compute space, the networking space, and the storage space to actually make that possible. So understanding applications is the first part in understanding the next generation compute technologies, understanding how virtualization applies. If you're not doing virtualization today, I would be highly shocked. But understanding what that means and how that applies then to network service and storage service and how all those different services map together, especially the quality of service sorts of components in network and storage. On the compute side, quality of service doesn't usually get brought out directly, but as I virtualize these services, as I start applying containers as my way of bundling my application, I have to think more and more about the scheduling of where those resources live. I might have 50 or 100 physical compute resources available to me in a data center environment, or 1,000 virtual services in a third-party systems providers environment, but how am I actually managing where my applications live in this dynamic environment is becoming more and more critical. How I map those locations of where services live to the network capabilities, the storage performance capabilities. These are the new areas that we need to understand and we need to get educated on. We need to understand how it's going to apply to the applications that we have to deploy today and in the near future as distributed applications become more the default way of building new application environments. In addition, we need to understand the practice of deploying these services. And that really leads me to thinking about the operations environment, so the analytics, the services capabilities that exist there, and of course, the new services that are coming on, thinking about database as a service, thinking about messaging as a service, thinking about analytics as a service, both for internal use, understanding how your data center is operating, and of course, deploying that out to end users. Well, one of the best ways that you can actually do this is not just taking classes to understand the technology, but to actually put it into practice. Start deploying database as a service platforms. Start deploying cloud service platforms, so end-to-end middleware automation services like OpenStack. Or if your business is really forward-thinking and really has exclusively decided to use containerization as the way of managing applications, even deploying your own container-based infrastructure, container-based operating environment, whether it be just a Kubernetes or Docker service, or something more advanced like a Rancher or CoreOS class of infrastructure. Deploying these services has become increasingly easy over time, and actually making that available to your end users, allowing them to start using these new technologies, it helps educate you and helps educate them. So look, there are a number of things that we've talked about in this webinar, and I would love to get your feedback on more information that you would like in the next sets of sessions, which will be coming shortly. But just to get you started on some of this, I think there are a lot of different approaches. Obviously, there's a lot of information on YouTube, and I've given you some areas to start looking at, things like virtualization and containerization. Those two technology spaces alone will give you plenty of YouTube videos to watch for many, many hours. But also looking at tools like OpenStack, looking at the documentation around these environments. Because one of the things that I think has happened in the open source service management space is that the documentation has, I think, kept pace to a certain extent with the capabilities of how people are using these tools, and the capabilities that you need to understand as an operator. So looking at OpenStack as a tool set for the cloud operations space is interesting because you can deploy it yourself, so you can build your own OpenStack environment, whether you actually have customers or basically end users running on it or not, and understand what it means then to start operating this environment. The documentation in the OpenStack space, I think, is probably some of the best in terms of the open source service management space. Again, YouTube has lots of how-tos and seminar videos that describe some of the new technologies in this space. While it's not necessarily the simplest way to learn things, it is certainly a very powerful learning service. The other thing I would say is that within this environment, especially in the operating environment, there are a number of really good tutorials from what I think of as sort of the two leading service deployment models for cloud service in a third-party service provider environment. Amazon is still the juggernaut in this space, and they have a number of really good how-to guides and service guides, and just in terms of understanding how these different pieces fit together. DigitalOcean is another company that has built actually a great community of people trying to understand how applications that get deployed are operated in a cloud-like environment. DigitalOcean having a similar but different model to Amazon. And of course, like I said, the YouTube model for doing the same sort of thing against OpenStack is another really big key. And I would be remiss in not pointing you to a couple of the services that Cumulus provides. First off, we have our 5 Minutes of Cloud channel. 5 Minutes of Cloud, again, are little 5-minute snippets that try to help sort of at least capture the essence of some of the changes that are happening in data center environments going to cloud. What are these new technologies? How do they work? How do I need to start thinking about them? And in general, those have had a little bit more of sort of a business/cloud operator perspective rather than application operator perspective. But we're constantly adding new videos there to try to continue to help explain what's going on in the cloud space. We certainly have education, so if some of the high-level services and sort of the do-it-yourself model isn't quite getting you there fast enough, taking classes from a company like ours is another approach, and we have a number of classes both in the compute service and middleware management space, specifically around OpenStack, and we're increasing the number of containerized focused education services as well. And lastly, and actually maybe not least, is the concept of certification. In the past, if you were a sysadmin, you might have gotten Red Hat certified or Microsoft certified, depending on the type of operating systems and operating environments that you were using. And those certifications are still critical and important today. If you were a storage operator, maybe you would have gotten EMC or NetApp certified. Network operator, there was Juniper and Cisco and Arista certification against the network infrastructure and services. Now with SDN vendors, with virtualized storage vendors, with virtualization at the compute level, there are a number of additional certifications that you can take. We're actually looking at this from the management middleware space and have created training specifically around the certified OpenStack administrator training. This is another area where having certification goes beyond just understanding the physical servers themselves and starts really looking at how do all these pieces fit together, how can I actually automate the end-to-end storage and service space. And that really is the gist of getting trained, understanding how these pieces fit together, and certainly getting certified in some of these new technology areas as well. So that's what we had for you today. Hopefully this was a useful little seminar that provide you some ideas. And again, just thinking back through what we talked about, the space is shifting because people are looking at different ways of deploying their applications. Understanding that application deployment leads you to a number of changes in how the data centers need to be structured, the services that you as a systems operator, data center operator, and specifically cloud operator are changing. And we've talked about some of the tools and ways of sort of becoming the leader in that space for your environment. In future sessions, we'll dive more deeply into the specifics of some of these environments, actually look at how some of these things actually operate and work to give you a better idea, again, of how you can become a cloud operator. Thank you very much. Again, this has been Robert Starmer with Cumulus Technologies.